Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled FBI's on Langston Hughes and Martin Luther King Jr. Our leader for this session is W. Jason Miller, NHC Fellow 2022-2023, Professor of English at North Carolina State University. I'd also like to acknowledge Anna Anderson, who is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council, who will serve as the TA for tonight's session. Dr. Jason Miller's research interests include 20th century American poetry, American literature, literary theory, and pedagogy. His expertise on Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech was featured on the Smithsonian podcast King's Speech, where he was in conversation with Kevin Young, director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. His research on MLK and Dorothy Cotton featured in New York Daily News, Our State Magazine, The News Observer, The Conversation, WNC News, Capital Tonight with Tim Boyum, and on The State of Things. Poet Kwame Alexander issued a nationwide writing challenge on NPR in 2021 based on Jason's research. His newest public research on MLK is spotlighted in Walter Magazine's The King's Speech, The Day King Addressed Campus, and The Klan Marched on Raleigh, and in Margaret E. Baker's short documentary film and digital installation, King and the Klan, A Visual Experience. His latest online digital project is Backlash Blues, Nina Simone and Langston Hughes. New North Carolina connections between the poet and the singer have recently been featured as the cover stories in both Asheville's Mountain Express and NC State Magazine. He served as a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 2022-2023 to continue work on his forthcoming book documenting the relationship between the famous poet and singer. Featured songs by Sandra Dubose, he has lectured and been in discussion with NC Poet Laureate Jackie Shelton Green at the North Carolina Museum of Art to celebrate Nina Simone's birthday. Complete with 36 photographs, his biography on Langston Hughes is available from the University of Chicago Press. It was recently been featured in the piece Langston Hughes, International Superstar. His project with MLK and the KKK met in Raleigh documents the KKK's 1,800-person march down Fayetteville Street on the day Dr. King spoke in Reynolds Coliseum on July 31st, 1966. Startling, never-before-developed photographs have been digitized from original negatives. These were first displayed at a gallery exhibit at the African American Cultural Center and are now permanently available for view in the iPearl Immersion Theater at Hunt Library. His discovery of never-before-seen footage of King speaking while the KKK protests was featured on WRAL TV. Dr. Miller's, as a published poet, his work was featured in such places as Walter Magazine, Poetry East, the South Carolina Review, and the Spartus Palace. He earned the title Alumni Distinguished Undergraduate Professor in 2022 and was admitted into the Academy of Outstanding Teachers in 2027. To our audience, our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar and leader for this session, Dr. Jason Miller. Jason, we're honored to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Mike. It's wonderful to renew connections with you after our time at the center.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And what a wonderful introduction. I'm humbled. I hope I can live up to half those wonderful things you mentioned about me. To all the teachers out there, I want to begin by saying that I firmly believe that teaching is the world's most noble profession. My wife is a public educator of 31 years. I spent 5 years in the public school system teaching 9th and 10th graders, and I currently, for the last 19 years, serve in the largest teacher education program in the state of North Carolina. So on a regular basis, I am preparing future educators. And so to have you as an audience is an absolute honor because I know how important and critical your work is, and I know what an amazing impact you're having. What I'd like to do tonight is break down the presentation into kind of 3 different sections. I'd like to give you an overview of exactly how Dr. King was reciting and using Langston Hughes' poems. After that first section, I think we'll have a chance for a small break. I'd like to move into how Dr. King was directly engaging with Hughes' most important signature metaphor, the dream. And then in the third section, I'll pick up on the resources that are available to you on the site and talk about very specific lesson plans. Again, teaching and educating educators is not a side interest of mine. It's very central to what I do. So if we could, let's begin with the first slide, and I'll give you a chance to see some of the interesting artifacts and items I deal with as a scholar. You are looking at correspondence and connection between the great Martin Luther King and Langston Hughes. In the top left-hand corner, Dr. King is acknowledging poems Langston Hughes sent to him. On the right, Coretta Scott King is asking if they can meet when they come to New York City in 1964. On the right, you'll see that when Langston Hughes finished plays, he often autographed personal copies and sent them to Martin Luther King. And if you're ever fortunate enough to come across a genuine Langston Hughes signature, it's always going to be in super show green, as you'll see in the bottom right. How efficient was Mr. Hughes? Well, as soon as he crossed that T, he was already starting the H in his last name. On the left is the most startling artifact on this page, though. This is Dr. King personally inviting Langston Hughes to march in Selma in 1965. And when you're Langston Hughes, you don't just show up in any particular way. No, Hughes went down to Selma in 1965 by catching a plane with Nina Simone, and they landed together as dear friends and participated in the concert beforehand. Let me just set a context for us. I know many of you out there are real experts on Hughes, but even experts can learn something new, as I have always found. All the textbooks you will have available to you will falsely say that Langston Hughes was born in 1902. We learned about 5 years ago that he's actually born in 1901, and he died in May of 1967. And so if this connection between Dr. King and Langston Hughes is confusing, it's often because we forget that Langston Hughes only died 11 months before Dr. King's assassination. As such, they knew each other, talked, traveled overseas to Nigeria together, and exchanged immense correspondence. Why this connection is hidden will become clear as we move on, but I want to start there for us. And just in case you haven't brushed up on Langston Hughes in a while, remember that when you come across or teach Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, that play is, of course, taking his title from Langston Hughes' most popular poem, where he asked, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? So let's listen to a little bit of how Dr. King was engaging with Langston Hughes' poetry. Here on the next slide, we'll have a chance to hear Dr. King quoting Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again. Here's the audio of Dr. King in 1967.
Me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the
Now, what is so startling about Dr. King's use of Hughes' poetry is that in this particular context, he quoted the famous poem line for line and word for word. In 1967, from that speech, April 4th, the lines of Hughes were actually broadcast on national TV. To be controversial, to speak out against the Vietnam War, to take a stand against the Johnson administration, King invoked the subversive, often considered anti-American poetry of Langston Hughes. And for those of you that are wondering, yes, that political slogan comes from this Langston Hughes poem. It was first invoked in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. It was tried by many other folks, including Rick Santorum, and recently the riffing on that title has made its way into our national discussion. So Dr. King would sometimes quote Langston Hughes' poetry word for word in his speeches and sermons. The next slide I want to take you to is an image of the first time Dr. King ever wrote for a national publication. So we move from 1967 now to 1956. When Dr. King was asked to write for Newsweek magazine, he actually quoted another poem by Langston Hughes known as Mother to Son. Mother to Son is a classic poem that King not only knew, but often recited from memory. The reason he recited it from memory is because it was his wife, Coretta Scott King's favorite poem. The first time he ever used it was the first time she celebrated a Mother's Day, and when he used it from the podium to talk on a Sunday, the response was so voracious that he continued to apply it and use it in his speeches and talks. So on our next slide, I'm going to move to right now, is an image of Dr. King reciting Mother to Son, and you can find this online on YouTube by simply clicking in Martin Luther King, Mother to Son. But what I wanted to do here is I wanted you to actually listen to Coretta Scott King quoting the poem. After her husband's assassination, Coretta stepped in on several occasions and filled in for speaking engagements. Here is the audio of Coretta Scott King invoking the poem by Langston Hughes, Mother to Son.
Listen to this black mother as she counsels her son in all of her ungrammatical profundity. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splitters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I've been climbing on and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you sit down on the steps 'cause you finds it's kinda hard. Don't you stop now. For I's still going, honey. I's still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. With this determination, with this faith, we will be able to create new homes, new communities, new cities, a new nation, yea, a new world, which we desperately need.
Mrs. Coretta Scott King with an address made in Central Park, New York City in late April 1968 at the 27th Peace March against the war in Vietnam. For more information about From the
Why would Dr. King want to use Langston Hughes' poetry in his speeches and sermons? By the time we're done tonight, we'll have many ways of answering that, but let's start off this way. Dr. King had the capacity to break things down dialogically, syllogistically, and dialectically. He could speak a polysyllabic psychobabble so fast he could make your head spin. He could fill it with anaphora, epistrophe, and medial caesura, and he even knew how to bend sounds like stops, dentals, sibilants, diphthongs, and even the breathlessness of voiceless fricatives. In fact, Dr. King was so formally educated that often he tried to connect to audiences by instead invoking a poet of the people, Langston Hughes, on the level of so many of his followers, so he didn't get accused of being a little too educated and formal in the way that he presented materials. Now, those two examples of Coretta and Dr. King using Langston Hughes' poems are very simple to find, but when I started this 10-year process, I came across others that were very difficult to locate. You're now looking at a handwritten draft of Langston Hughes' poem entitled Youth. In this version, he entitled it Tomorrow as he was driving across the state of North Carolina in 1931 and writing it out by hand. In this famous poem, Youth, Langston Hughes says, "We have tomorrow bright before us." Those simple words would escape you if you didn't have Langston Hughes' poems branded on your consciousness. Dr. King invoked this phrase. Instead of saying tomorrow bright, he would say bright tomorrows. He did this on over 70 occasions in letters, prayers, and speeches. Here's one that you would miss if you didn't know how deeply embedded his mind was in the poetry of Langston Hughes. On this next slide, you're looking at Dr. King standing on a milk crate talking to 10,000 people at Cobo Hall in Detroit on June 23, 1963. And during this moment, he alludes to that poem by talking about bright tomorrows. Here's the audio of Dr. King in 1963. In that moment, in 1963, Dr. King is only alluding to Langston Hughes. Here's why. I don't want to bury the lead. I'll say this twice. From exactly April of 1960 to March 15th of 1965, the moments when Dr. King was most in the national spotlight, he never once named Langston Hughes. He never once mentioned that the ideas he was using or the metaphors he was invoking came from Hughes. The reason is this, and leads to the title of tonight's webinar. During that window, from 1960 to 1965, Dr. King was under the greatest threat of FBI surveillance. He could not afford to be linked to a poet that in 1953 had been accused of being a communist, who had appeared before Joseph McCarthy's committee. And in fact, the FBI was such on the case of Dr. King that key personnel such as Jack Odell, Bayard Rustin, and Dr. King's closest advisor, Stanley Levinson, were actually forbidden to talk to Dr. King because of threats of their past communist ties and connections to Dr. King. So listen carefully. Before 1960, Dr. King used Langston Hughes' name as much as he wanted to. After 1965, he did again because Lyndon Baines Johnson on March 15th had said we shall all overcome, and the FBI power over Dr. King waned. So the point of my research is to show that in that window of time, though Dr. King don't overtly name Langston Hughes, he still continued to use his ideas and played a very dangerous subversive game of building in Hughes' metaphors and outdistancing and out-confusing the FBI surveillance, which would have found him to be invoking somebody that they were very much against. So those allusions are not because Dr. King wanted to take Langston Hughes' ideas or because he was sloppy in his thinking. They were because of that larger context he had to avoid. Now, here's an amazing example. The next slide you're looking at is a poem by Langston Hughes written in 1956 about Dr. King. And in that poem called Brotherly Love, one of 7 poems Dr. King used in his speeches and sermons, Langston Hughes wrote the words, "Anyhow, I'm going to love you still." Now, I have a copy of a speech that Dr. King gave, and before this poem came out, he just had a normal ending. As soon as this poem came out, he invoked 3 different poems by Langston Hughes on the very same day. And here's what it sounded like. "I'm going to love you still" gets altered, and the power of this and the force of this cannot be underestimated. On this slide, we'll now hear Dr. King referencing brotherly love. Listen to how he changes the words from "I'm going to love you still" and switches them up just a bit. Here's the audio of Dr. King.
I've seen too much hate to want to hate myself. I've seen hate on the faces of too many sheriffs, too many white citizens, counselors, and too many Klansmen of the South to want to hate myself. And every time I see it, I say to myself, hate is too great a burden to bear. Yes. And somehow we must be able to stand up before our most bitter opponents and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws and abide by the unjust system, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And so throw us in jail, and we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children, and as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities at the midnight hour and drag us out on some wayside road and leave us half dead as you beat us, and we will still love you. Send your propaganda agents around the country and make it appear that we are not fit culturally and otherwise for integration, but we'll still love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And one day we will win our freedom. We will not only win freedom for ourselves, yes, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process. And our victory, yes, will be a double victory.
Dr. King's use of Langston Hughes' poems was so effective that there are times where he went to end speeches and he anticipated adding on multiple paragraphs. But in one instance in Greensboro, North Carolina, when he went into this, "We will still love you," the crowd came to its feet and applauded so much that when Dr. King stepped away from the podium and tried to come back, he realized he couldn't. When the glass is filled, how can it be made more full? He ended his speech short of his prepared marks, learning that he could use Hughes's ideas without referencing them, and that the best places for these were at the ends of public speeches. So I'd like to take our first break right now, in case people would like to chime in or have comments and questions. We've had a sense up to now of some of the ways Dr. King was using Langston Hughes' poems, and then afterwards we'll turn to the dream and some lesson plans. So our first break right now, in case folks have people want to weigh in or ask questions.
All right, good deal. Thank you so much for that, Jason. And again, I'll remind everyone, if you should have any questions whatsoever, please enter them into the managed Q&A chat here. I see in the audience chat someone asked if the audio is actually downloadable. So if you can weigh in on that, just let me know, Jason. But the question that comes to mind is we're fully aware that you have devoted over a decade to this work, and that your work is in English, and that you're a poet. Can you speak to how this work has enriched your classroom? as it is the intersection of history and English literature and poetry. Can you tell us, kind of guide us through how that's impacted your classroom instruction over the better course of a decade or more?
Absolutely. So there are several things I do in my class and inform my future teachers of that are specific lessons. As Dr. King started rewriting and riffing on Langston Hughes' poetry, I often ask my students to create lesson plans in which they ask their own classrooms to rewrite Langston Hughes' poems. The short list for these that work particularly well with vast experience are poems like Dream Deferred or Harlem. The poem we'll see shortly, I Dream a World, and of course, Mother to Son that we've already heard. So one very brief example, often teachers will go to their class and they will have their students write a poem that's something like son to mother or daughter to father, and they will follow the format of Langston Hughes' poem and say something that they wish they could communicate to a parent in this regard or another significant other. What's fascinating about these lessons is that they're not only engaging in Hughes' poetry, but they're actually doing the same thing that Dr. King was doing, which is riffing, altering, and invoking their own voice in these particular ways. So students themselves realize that Hughes is kind of a point that they can depart from, write their own works, and get a sense of exactly the kind of ways Dr. King was moving words around in a shell game or altering them in particular ways. And then the last thing I'd say to that question is, as we'll see shortly, students also realize entirely different ways to engage with Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech, but as well these speeches against Vietnam.
Good deal. Thank you so much. And I have a process question, and I'm sure you'll address this a little bit later. But I'm interested. I was looking through the NC State website, and what caught my eye was the heading 98 Seconds of History on a Super 8. So at some point, I'd be interested in hearing more about that and the Marshall Wyatt experience. As far as the video footage that his father was able to capture as well. So really interested to hear more about that.
I'd be happy to address that now before we move on to the second section. So what's so fun about the research I get to engage with is I realize that history doesn't live in timelines and textbooks, and it often isn't library archives. It's not only in people's heads and their hearts, but it's also in people's attics and basements. And so when Martin Luther King came to speak on my campus in July 31st, 1966, our library didn't have a single documented item about that visit. And so when I started tracking down that and finding things, I eventually came up with a man who had a Super 8 film recorder, and he went out that day and tracked the Klan rally, a counter protest, and then went inside and turned his camera on the television screen where Dr. King was speaking across the state. And so it's really the only record we have of Dr. King speaking in this kind of visible way. And so Marshall Wyatt's incredible contribution has really filled in the gaps. And so this archival research takes me to the strangest places and brings me in contact with amazing people.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. And, when I review this, I'm going to extract that quote about history, sometimes living in basements. And I think that's so important for our teachers who are here. So thank you for fielding those questions. Again, everyone, if you should have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A chat. And we'll be sure to bring them to Jason's attention at the appropriate time. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you so much. So I'll move on to the second part now, the most interesting part for me. And of course, we have to naturally kind of build on these items as we move on and continue. If Dr. King was engaging in all these other poems, how is he engaging in Langston Hughes' signature metaphor of the dream? We talk about items that live in people's basements. One of the most startling items I was able to find in archive is Langston Hughes' first handwritten draft of his most famous poem, known as Harlem or Dream Deferred, in which he wrote out by hand what he was thinking. Now, this idea of a dream deferred was published in 1951, became the title of Lorraine Hansberry's famous play, and is probably used in many of your classrooms in many important ways. If you can see this draft, Hughes's first go-round on August 7th, 1948, wasn't to say that does it explode at the end, but instead he said, or does it atom-like explode and leave deaths in its wake? Hughes' original draft was actually thinking about nuclear war in his response to things that happened just a few years before in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But how was Dr. King invoking Hughes' idea of the dream if he's using all these other poems? Here is audio of Dr. King referencing Langston Hughes' Dream Deferred.
Yes, I am personally the victim of deferred dreams, of blasted hopes. But in spite of that, I close today, yes, sir, by saying I still have a dream. Because you know you can't give up in life. If you lose hope somehow, you lose that vitality that keeps life moving. You lose that courage to be, that quality that helps you to go on in spite of. And so today I still have a dream. Men
You and your students will be stunned to learn that the first time Dr. King ever engaged in the idea of dreaming was to talk about shattered dreams and blasted hopes. This is so hard for us because we always imagine Dr. King being forward-looking, hopeful, thinking about a vision for the future and the positive aspects of having a dream. But on April 5th, 1959, Dr. King created a brand new sermon entitled Shattered Dreams. In that sermon, his thesis was, everyone here has been the victim of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Now, I had a graduate student take 6 weeks tracking down why Dr. King was going through and talking about dreams exploding and being shattered in 1959. I said, where you need to start is you need to look at the Montgomery Advertiser and the New York Times, two newspapers that Dr. King took. Here's what she found. On March 19th, a play known as A Raisin in the Sun debuted at the Ethel Barrymore Theater. It was an immediate runaway success, bringing in integrated audiences for the first time on Broadway. The coverage in both the Montgomery Advertiser and the New York Times continued to say that the play was about blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Dr. King always knew what was going on culturally, and so he brought that into his sermons and talks. So let's be clear. The first time Dr. King ever engaged with the idea of a dream was to talk about it in negative fashion in direct response to Langston Hughes' poem, A Dream Deferred. And I'd like to be a little bit more specific on the chronology because I'm a scholar. The first Sunday Dr. King came back from India with his first biographer, L.D. Reddick, was Palm Sunday. He had to give a Palm Sunday sermon. The next Sunday was Easter. The first free Sunday he had is when he started invoking this idea of deferred dreams and blasted hopes. So Dr. King recognized the urgency of it and began evoking it immediately. But just because he started then doesn't mean it stopped then. Dr. King continued to write newspaper articles for the Chicago Defender, and in that capacity he started referencing Langston Hughes in that window of time when it was safe to after 1965. And so Dr. King was always coming back to this notion of deferred dreams. Now, just in case you've had a really long day and started incredibly early out there with your students, please don't miss this out there. You had an idea that Langston Hughes was an amazing person, but probably you had no idea that he was this cool. This is Langston Hughes selling Smirnoff vodka in Ebony magazine in 1959. Ask your students what poet today would have the clout and visibility to do such an ad on television, radio, or newsprint. This advertisement was seen by at least 350,000 people because that's what the subscription was for Ebony. But of course, we know from great periodical scholarship that many of these magazines sat in doctors' offices, beauty parlors, or dentist offices, and were read multiple times a day for over a month. It's hard to estimate how many million people would have seen this image of Hughes. Langston Hughes was never more popular than he was in 1960 in America. Think of where that window puts him in terms of Dr. King wanting to invoke him and engage with his ideas. Now, when you're this popular, wouldn't you like to know what it feels like? When you're this popular, you get amazing invitations from folks. This is a letter Langston Hughes received, and it has an unusual request. I'll just pick out a few details from it without looking at it word for word. The person underlines and says, "We were wondering if you would write a special poem for a certain occasion to celebrate the great leader, A. Philip Randolph. We want to have a birthday celebration for him in Carnegie Hall, free and open to the public." At the very end of the statement, there's these lines, and they're quite interesting. The writer of this letter says to Langston Hughes, quote, "To add a personal note, my admiration for your works is not only expressed in my personal conversations, but I can no longer count the number of times and places all over the nation in my addresses and sermons in which I have read your poems. I know of no better way to express in beauty the heartbeat and struggle of our people. I hope you can find it possible to fulfill this request. With warmest personal regards, very sincerely, Martin Luther King, Jr." The exchange that I've been talking about was known between these two American icons. It was lost to us because of the categories and disciplinarity in which we take King and only think of him as a historical figure, a subject of sociology, or we think about his religious inspiration. Once we take account of his deep and reverent love for literature and his connections to poets like Langston Hughes, we start to recover what was known during the time. This is an article that was known between these two men. How much King used Hughes's poetry was not unknown to each of them. The lengths of it are staggering. This next slide gets me a little overexcited, so bear with me. Because of this combination of things, we actually come to a moment in time where Dr. King asked Langston Hughes to write that poem, and Langston Hughes said yes. And by saying yes, he noted in very important fashion that he was going to fulfill the request and write a special poem about this. And so on the right, he wrote a poem for the occasion in early 1960. And lo and behold, this poem had never been published anywhere. I uncovered it, presented it in my research, and you'll not believe that the subject of this poem was about A. Philip Randolph being a dreamer. After the poem was presented, Dr. King stood up in front of a sold-out crowd that came into Carnegie Hall and said A. Philip Randolph had always had the capacity to dream, and he had dreamed and had visions that no one else had. So the second deep connection Dr. King had with the idea of dreaming turned positive because of this unknown, unpublished poem by Langston Hughes. And so this kind of evidence is really remarkable for finding out and discovering the origins of Dr. King's dream. Now, if you'll give me just a little second here, we're going to pause in the next section because we have Dream Deferred, and now we have this poem called Poem for a Man About Dreams. But Langston Hughes' signature poem is a poem entitled I Dream a World. And in that particular poem, Langston Hughes spells out the cadence, the theme, and the repetition that you will all recognize as being central to Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream. What I'd first like to have you do is listen to Danny Glover recite the poem, and while we're getting ready to listen to that, I want to make a careful note. This poem is very hard to find in audio, but you can find a Google Doodle in which the poem is spelled out, and it's beautiful to use in the classroom. I use it all the time. We're going to listen to Langston Hughes' poem, I Dream a World. I want you to think of the connections to Dr. King's great dream, and then I'll spell out how that happened, those connections. I Dream a World by Langston Hughes, recited by Danny Glover.
I too dream a world. I dream a world where man would know no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, no avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. Of such I dream your world. Of such I dream our world.
On August 11th, 1956, Dr. King first enunciated the ideas that would become central to his famous dream. Great scholars who preceded me had made this clear. He talked about a new world, a world in which things would be altered, changed, and made different. What I did is I took the prose we had from Dr. King's speech on that day, and I had an inkling. What if we broke it down as poetry and didn't assume he was just speaking prose? When I broke down Dr. King's lines from 1956, I put them side by side with Langston Hughes' poem, I Dream a World, and realized that Dr. King had been rewriting and riffing on them in imaginative ways, demonstrating and modeling to his audience that all our voices can be collective, and when we signify, riff, allude, or as your students will say, sample the works of those who come before us, we then realize how interdependent, and in Dr. King's enunciation, how interrelated we all are. In 1956, Dr. King had the confidence to talk about a new world based on this poem, but he didn't engage the idea of a metaphor of dreaming until November 27, 1962. If I could pause here real quickly, this gets a little complicated. We had Dr. King giving his famous I Have a Dream speech. You all know when it was, August 28, 1963. I had Dr. King reinventing Langston Hughes' poem, I Dream a World, from 1956. But I was missing, 9 years into this study, the touchstone speech where Dr. King first started talking about dreaming, where it became his first enunciation of this positive dream before the March on Washington. Here's what happened. Dr. King was rewriting his sermon, Shattered Dreams, yes, the one from 1959 in response to Raisin in the Sun, and in his own hand he wrote this line, "We have long dreamed of freedom." And in his own hand, when he came to the word dreamed in late 1962, he wrote over it 6 or 7 times, just like a student who can't pay attention during the last period of the day because they're thinking about going home. And you could literally see him fixated on the page on the ideal of dreaming. So lo and behold, I had the privilege of traveling all across the country to incredible archives in Boston University, Atlanta, and any number of occasions in Yale. And you're not going to believe this, but the most important artifact I found was less than an hour from where I live and work. It was in a little town called Rocky Mount, North Carolina. And yes, it was a teacher who saved the audio from a speech Dr. King delivered about his dream 9 months before the March on Washington. 1.4 millimeter acetate in a box that had rust on it and was crinkled at the end. The reel was cracked, and I was very worried if there was any sound on it at all. When we located it, we were able to put it in, play it, restore it, because it actually had to be slowed down in places and sped up in others. Otherwise, the transcript and audio would have still been filled with guess words and question marks. And what we heard was, you're not going to believe it, the same speech Dr. King delivered on August 11, 1956 about a new world. He re-delivered on November 27, 1962, but this time, instead of just talking about a world, he talked about his dream. This is the audio of the first time Dr. King ever enunciated his dream. It's 9 months before the March on Washington. This is the speech of Dr. King from Rocky Mount. I hardly know what to say after hearing that amazing, soaring rhetoric from Dr. King, other than to provide testimony of people I've been able to talk to who attended that speech and build out a larger context for that event. What were things like in rural North Carolina in 1962? When Dr. King arrived at the airport in Raleigh, North Carolina, he was picked up by the Stokes family hearse and driven into Rocky Mount because fears of Klan attacks were so profuse. When he arrived there, people that housed him and fed him had to use code words over the phone to make sure that nobody listening in on those phone lines could figure out where he was. For the meal that was served at George Dudley's house before the talk, Helen Gay, an incredible city councilwoman from the area, picked up the phone to invite her friends over once Dr. King arrived by using the code phrase, "The blackberry pie is ready." That signaled to them that they should come over, but it also meant that anyone listening wouldn't have any idea what she was talking about. More startling, we often think of Dr. King only in nonviolent terms, but George Dudley's wife had other ideas. When she saw unusual cars parked outside of her house, she was spotted on certain mornings standing on the porch in her bathrobe, holding a shotgun with shells in both pockets. The tension surrounding Dr. King's visit was really intense, and it shaped what he was able to do and what he was able to present. More importantly, I'll keep this short list very brief. 4 different people that simply heard Dr. King speak had their lives changed, and their lives are a testimony to the accuracy of that statement. One man named Reverend Tolokum Omakunde got to sit down with Dr. King in the library and drink a Coke with another student named Brenda Armstrong. They were signaled out as key star students at Booker T. Washington, and so they got to meet with Dr. King and draw inspiration. By the end of that weekend, the Reverend knew that he wanted to become a pastor, and he has done that every day of his life since. Brenda Armstrong had an incredibly notable future. She went on to become the first African-American cardiologist at Duke University here in our state, and two other women, Joyce Wilkins and another woman named the incredible Angela Bryant, went on to serve in the community and serve in Congress in our state. People looked back at a visit by Dr. King as something that absolutely altered and changed their lives. Here's what I want to say before we move on to the last section. I'm just going to keep moving through unless anything else is on people's agenda. So, step back, big picture stuff. I'll go slowly. All this means something important to Langston Hughes. It means that his poetry is as central to the civil rights movement of the 1960s as it is to the Harlem Renaissance. If you only have opportunities to bring him into conversation in the 1920s, please consider bringing him into conversation in the 1960s, because that's how his work was represented, coming from the lips of the incredible Dr. King. Second, and more complicated for us, and something that takes a little bit of time to absorb, is despite our inclinations and expectations and anticipations that Dr. King's dream is only prophetic and from the Bible, we realize very quickly that the foundations and origins of his dream actually come from poetry. Those dates again are August 11th, 1956, April 5th, 1959, and January 24th, 1960. Dr. King had the roots that were poetic. He eventually linked it to the American dream to draw in white audiences, and only near the very end of its development did he bring in the third thread of prophecy, realizing that it could also speak across all kinds of divides in America by tapping into that Old Testament prophetic level. It has all three of those threads, meaning and reminding us that poetry is where memory breathes. And when people walked out and remembered Dr. King's dream, it was because of its poetry and its metaphor in this regard. So what I'd like to do is just continue on directly here to the last section, and then we can have some questions or input as folks would like. Lesson planning. The very next slide you're looking at is a reminder that despite all the things we can uncover and know, there are so many things we never get to. It took another 7 years trying to track down this item, and it's not been found, and maybe somebody in 30 or 50 years will find it, but it does lead to a very interesting teaching lesson. You are looking at a postcard to Langston Hughes sent in May of 1967. It is addressed to him, and yes, postcards at that time really only cost 4 cents. The opposite side is startling. It says, "Dear Mr. Hughes, your letter came to Dr. King during his absence from our city. He's scheduled to return to the Atlanta offices in about 10 days, at which time your correspondence will be brought to his attention for reply, Miss Dora McDonald, assistant to Dr. Martin Luther King." Here's the backstory, the startling facts, and then a way that this can be used in the classroom. When Langston Hughes was on his deathbed, he requested paper and pen, and he hand wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King. Had Hughes been at his home, he would have kept a copy. He would have had an assistant make a duplicate, a mimeograph copy, a carbon copy, where we get the letter CC from that we still use on emails. But because he was in the hospital on his deathbed, there was only one copy, and he mailed it to Dr. King. We know that letter arrived to Dr. King, and he received it because this postcard tells us that. The letter Langston Hughes wrote has not been found. I can't even begin to tell you what that 7 years of extra looking felt like and the incredible people it brought me into contact with. If the letter is ever found, it might be among Coretta Scott King's items, which are still not available for view in Atlanta, because she had the deepest reverence for Langston Hughes, even more than Dr. King, and she had every book Langston Hughes ever published, and that was the source Dr. King referenced when he was preparing his speeches and sermons. But here's what I do with this item in class, and you can consider other spins and riffs off of it. After presenting this information, I often will ask my students to write a physical letter imagining what Langston Hughes might have said to Dr. King. Now, you can imagine some of the things that come across their imagination. Items about, why weren't you able to name me? Items about Langston Hughes' encouragement to Dr. King as he grew out of favor after speaking out against Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and of course, perhaps other personal things as he's on his deathbed. And if you'd like to and have time to extend it further, you could even ask students to respond to that letter, imagining what Dr. King might have said if he had time. Again, the reason Dr. King did not respond is because in that window of time, Langston Hughes died, and by the time Dr. King got back to the office, there was no reason to write a letter to Langston Hughes that had already passed on. The last thing I'd like to mention before we move into any questions or comments and anything I can continue to talk on is I want to refer you to two other possible lesson ideas. This is rewriting the postcard in letter form. The second is something I already mentioned. You can have students rewrite poems. I'd like to go into more detail on that. One of the most fascinating junior class projects I saw was to have students take the logic of I Dream a World and individually rewrite that poem about their own dreams for the present, and then taking the very best lines from every student's poem and making one class collective poem that they put up on the wall, and moving around physically in the classroom and thinking about what order they should go in and what should count. These are really interesting lessons that you can do in rewriting poems like Dream Deferred, I Dream a World, and Mother to Son. The second lesson I'd like to remind you of is I believe some of the materials I presented are ways to connect Langston Hughes' poems to teaching Raisin in the Sun. There are new exciting ways you can look at that. Furthermore, on the website King's First Dream, at the very end of the resource pages, I have a number of my former teachers who I'm still in touch with that have designed various lesson plans like the one I just talked about. You can follow, tweak, refine, make them your own. And then the most applicable thing you can do, that's just as easy as possible, is I was very honored when I wrote an article for The Conversation recently, and someone at Common Lit turned that into a lesson plan. You can go to Common Lit or see the materials I provided here, and you can have students read basically everything I said in about a 900-word article compressed, and then go through a series of lessons on that. So again, just because it's so important to me, you can have students rewrite Hughes's poems. You can have students go back to A Raisin in the Sun and engage with that lesson plan. You can certainly have them write this postcard, and of course there's that lesson on Common Lit, and there is also plenty of opportunities on the King's First Dream website to hear this audio, learn more about King's trip to Rocky Mountain in 1962. I'd like to pause here for any comments, questions, or thoughts people have, and can follow up on these ideas. And thank you so much for this time and the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, so much. I appreciate that. And again, I encourage everyone to insert any questions that you may have. There are a few questions that came up. One was from Maria. She's an ESL teacher in a multicultural classroom. She was wondering if you're aware of any archives of Hughes' works in other languages. Anything that you can think of that you can point her to. Thank you.
Yes, this is quite remarkable. Thank you for that question. Langston Hughes had a number of his poems translated into Spanish. The number one poem, if you only picked one, is his poem I Too. You'll sometimes see it mistitled I Too Sing America. If you're not aware, Langston Hughes was responding to his favorite poet, Walt Whitman, who said, I hear America singing. And Langston Hughes' gentle response was, of all the carpenters, workmen, blacksmiths Whitman heard, he forgot to hear black Americans at work. And so Hughes' response is, I too sing America. That poem has been translated into Spanish on numerous occasions. And in a class that I teach here called Langston Hughes from Popular Cultural Civil Rights Movement, I actually recently had a student do their own translation of it based on their own understanding of Spanish. The background of the poem is really interesting as well. In 2016, in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of African American History and Culture was unveiled, and nobody could understand why the New York Times took out an entire full page reprinting that little poem, I Too. The reason became clear in a couple days. Folks that go through the section on history before moving up to the culture will find that poem 50 feet tall in gold letters along the wall. That poem has become central to the entire vibe and resonance of that museum, and it was celebrated immensely on September 23rd, 2016, when the museum was dedicated. In fact, to my knowledge, it's the only time that a sitting president, Barack Obama, built an entire speech, We Too Are America, based on a poem, and it was on Langston Hughes' poem. So the first great place to look is for alternate translations for Hughes' poem, I Too.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you. A question from Roberto. His question is, for years I have had students make connections between Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again, and the contemporary song, This Is America by Childish Gambino. But seeing as though that song is now 6 to 7 years old, I want to update it. Are there any other modern songs, poems, speeches that evoke similar themes that are similar to Hughes' poem? And I would invite any of the teachers who are in the chat to chime in on that one as well. Any of the contemporary poems. And Roberta, I think that's fascinating that you are using the Childish Gambino poem alongside Let America Be America Again. But Dr. Miller, are there any contemporary artists that you can think of?
That is a wonderful connection, and I would be all ears on exploring that. Often when students come to me and think about modern connections, they're able to tap kind of direct invocations of Hughes, and they think of even things like the 1969 group, The Last Poets, citing and building upon Langston Hughes' works. Modern connections are challenging in this particular way. However, one of the more interesting ones is that often you'll see Hughes kind of invoked in these popular cultural movements. Advertisements for Sprite have used his poems Dreams over and over again. But the modern connections are unique because from time to time he's listed and invoked as a name, but not so directly in his actual words. The key link is often looking at this idea of deferred and deferred dreams. My best example goes kind of beyond the specific links I know this question is asking for. But there are other ways that Langston Hughes has been really central to our language in America. When we talk about immigrants in this country, we call them dreamers because they're on a deferred status. And that idea of calling these folks that are waiting for their citizenship dreamers does come directly from Hughes' poem, Dream Deferred. So it does make our way into our lexicon. And again, I'll be all ears for other connections folks can make because I love that one that was brought up. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Roberto. Next question from Sonia. During your research on Hughes and Dr. King, did you come across any connections to the simple stories featured in serial form in leading Black newspapers? Have you included Hughes' simple stories or nonfiction works in your courses? If so, how did you incorporate them in your curriculum?
Thank you so much for that astute insight of really understanding Jesse B. Simple and his relationship with both these folks. Simple, or Simple, right, is a key character that does link these two men. One thing I was able to do is I counted 41 instances in which Langston Hughes' simple stories reference Dr. King. So beyond the poetry flowing back and forth between these two great American icons, Langston Hughes was advocating for, as he wrote it often in the Chicago Defender articles, Reverend King, and promoting and talking about his particular works. I was excited to think about the idea of Dr. King knowing about Simple, but here's the best answer for this, and you really want to do this because it'll be effective. Langston Hughes' 1956 poem is entitled Brotherly Love. In Brotherly Love, Langston Hughes first published it in the Chicago Defender, and when he presented at the Windy City Press Club later that year, he introduced it as being written in the voice of Jesse B. Simple. Now, if you teach and revisit that poem, Brotherly Love, and think about Hughes writing as Jesse B. Simple, you'll be capturing the tone, atmosphere, and dialect of that particular work. Hughes, writing as Simple for Brotherly Love, is a poem that Dr. King invoked and used when he talked about "We're going to love you still." And so that connection is very direct between them and accounts for the dialect and the attitude of the speaker at the end. That's very important. Love that information. Knowing about Jesse B. Simple is really inspiring to me. I'm so glad. Keep using that in the classrooms. Impressive.
Good deal. Thank you for that, Sonia. Great question. A question that comes up about Rocky Mount for teachers who are in or around North Carolina, Virginia, or the Southeast. In the video, we noticed the sign commemorating Dr. King's speech. Are there any other efforts by that community to memorialize that speech, or just the events surrounding his visit there? Like, say, for instance, if someone wanted to visit, are there any other notable commemorations of that time there?
Thank you for that. Dr. King's visit to Rocky Mount is so startling because the gymnasium still stands. And the city of Rocky Mount has been incredible in inviting and promoting this work. I can't even begin to tell you how humbled I was when just a few months after this, they named a stretch of highway right outside their town, Martin Luther King Highway. We were fortunate enough to restage the speech right in the gymnasium, right down to the level of knowing what part of the gymnasium Dr. King was in, what door he walked in, and we replayed the audio, and it was stunning because the audience that attended that day, all in sync with Dr. King at the end, because I know we didn't get clear at the end, said, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So the city of Rocky Mount has done a number of amazing things to recognize that work and bring up anniversary dates for it. The other thing I just want to mention as kind of a side note is it is startling to have the actual location where some of these speeches were given standing. Often people, when they get to the Rocky Mount speech, also want to know how interesting it was that he delivered a rough draft for the March on Washington. And I want to be clear that in November of 1962, there was no inkling for a March on Washington. And so Dr. King was literally just presenting a new idea, giving a speech, and then when he went to the March on Washington, personally decided to bring out his best material in that particular fashion. But I have always just been thrilled with the way that Rocky Mount has embraced the city's history and come to really invoke this. I'll say one more thing, and I just say one more thing so I don't go on and on this question. When we brought the speech out and digitized it, there was the most amazing community engagement project, completely orchestrated and done by the city. They reenacted the speech and a history around it by doing a play on stage in which two people that were actually in the speech starred, and they bussed in fourth graders and fifth graders on back-to-back nights and crowds of 800 each night, and they really educated the general public about this, and it was just wonderful to see the young people connecting with the previous generation and learning this history, and that was all a great credit to their amazing work.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question from Monica. Monica's question is, can you recommend more recent poems or poets that build off of the work of Langston Hughes? And I know that's a broad question, but any particular poets, particularly for our educators who are in the audience, who build off of that tradition? And she included both Langston Hughes, but the relationship between Langston Hughes and Dr. King. But any poets that you can speak of, yes, that you would recommend? Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful query. The number one person that comes to mind isn't necessarily as contemporary as you might be thinking in this regard, but for context, Leroy Jones / Amiri Baraka is a wonderful connection. He testified on many occasions that he began reading his poetry and music because of hearing Hughes do the same particular thing. Kwame Alexander doesn't have necessarily a direct link in terms of seeing references and allusions, but his work spells so well in the classroom and connects with students, and he is such an amazing, generous person that his works connect. And I don't want to oversell this because I don't want to put him on the spot, but I know of teachers in the past that have reached out to him, and he's actually sent books to his classrooms. And I mean, that kind of spirit is amazing in this particular regard. And, I think, Miss Gorman has all those cadences and rhythms as well. And I think listening to her works also captures. And I think, this linear fashion, kind of drawing the line to Hughes to other folks, is just as interesting as thinking about where the poetry and work is today. And as you're probably already thinking, it's wonderful to just turn it over to the students. What connections can you find to people that are, like we heard earlier, musicians today, references to television shows, commercials, or the poets of today that you find these connections to? And I love what the students will bring back. That's always a surprise to me and a new way of kind of thinking about it. And that can be rhythms, images, connections. The great Maya Angelou, of course, comes to mind, not as contemporary as you might be thinking, but of course her unbelievable words and ideas are important. And I'm just going to throw it in, going backwards. Again, I fully understand the question, but it's startling to think of how much time Hughes invested in Gwendolyn Brooks. And Hughes read her first manuscript, went through it carefully, and so a lot of those poems, you'll see she even has one she dedicates to Langston Hughes. So going both ways, I think, is a real positive aspect there.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I wish we had more time to explore that. I tell you, that relationship between Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks. Thank you so much for that. I know this may forecast a future webinar, but we're interested to hear about Backlash Blues. Is there some information that our teachers who will be looking forward to that book, to that work? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Share some information about that. And I say forecast because I would love to revisit this in a year and chat with you about that, because I think that's incredible what you're doing with that relationship between Nina Simone and Hughes. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and I would consider it to be a real honor and a pleasure to try to coordinate that as you see fit and as you fit your schedule, because that would be wonderful. So it's quite startling what you can uncover when you live really near where a lot of these things happened and took place. So very briefly, Langston Hughes established singer Nina Simone's reputation, and he actually solidified her moniker as the High Priestess of Soul. These are all very new things, and they're startling in their scope. In 1960, Langston Hughes wrote a national review in the Chicago Defender telling the world and America that Nina was very different from Billie Holiday. Even though they both recorded I Love You Porgy, Hughes could report with great authority that Nina's piano playing, her amazing energies and focus really put her in a new category of things. And that helped cement Simone when she'd only had 2 albums to her name. He went much further as a dear friend. He personally invited her to the Newport Jazz Festival in 1960 for what was a breakthrough concert of her career. And Nina engaged and saw Langston Hughes on those occasions. Finally, in later 1965, Hughes started suggesting songs that Nina sing, and I'll leave that list a little incomplete for now, but the list of songs he suggested was really interesting because Hughes was hanging out with more musicians in the 60s than he was writers. the heart of the research kind of builds from this moment. In 1967, Langston Hughes wrote a poem called Backlash Blues. As a poem, he decided to hand it to Nina Simone in October and say, "Would you like to set this to some music, Nina?" Nina took the poem, set it to music, and it became a really important song in her entire career. She continued to sing it for the next 9 years, almost on every occasion, and it was a startling statement about the white backlash that came in response to Black power. And the story of that poem and the story of Nina is very fascinating, because what happens is, when Langston Hughes dies in 1967, Nina has the poem, excuse me if I misspoke, in October of 1966. When Hughes dies in 1967, she writes a new verse into All Live Versions where she talks about my dear friend Langston Hughes and how much he wanted me to sing this song and present it. And so the material items connecting these two is very, very fascinating in terms of Hughes's connection. The last thing I'll say is, believe it or not, Langston Hughes met Nina when she was known as Eunice Wayman, taking studies in Asheville, North Carolina at the Allen School. And so I was able to, through help of a number of people, track down Nina's 91-year-old roommate who traveled with her for Glee Club presentations and could remember stories about being with Nina, and also the day when Langston Hughes came and presented. And so what the book project does is it tracks Langston Hughes and Nina's collaboration from 1949 to 1967. Those that are as excited as possible, there's a resource already out there, because with the book in process, I've also created a digital project. I'll go slowly here if I need to repeat this. You can type in simply Backlash Blues in your browser, and after the videos come up for the song, you come to the first major link and it says Backlash Blues Home. And there's an entire website giving an overview of all the biographical overlaps between the two, photographs of them together, songs they exchanged. And so that's backlashblues.com, and you just go down to the first actual site where it says home, and there's a lot of resources already out there that I've been able to create with a number of other wonderful colleagues.
Wow, thank you so much, Jason. I'm going to end with one question, and this is this may be a little on the personal side, but at some point there was a teacher. Tonight we had 710 teachers. At some point there was a teacher in a classroom who looked at little Jason Miller and said, "There's something special about Jason. There's something about Jason. I know at some point he's going to end up in Rocky Mount somewhere, and he's going to uncover a piece of history and know what, at any point in time it's uncovered." We have 700 of those teachers here right now. What advice would you give to them when they have that little girl in a classroom, that little boy in their classroom, they have someone in their classroom? What advice would you give to them in terms of nurturing this sense of discovery in them? And we'll end on that. So feel free to share, but just know that we appreciate you, and I think that would be valuable for them.
Thank you for that incredible question. I love the way you frame that, and I love the spirit of it, Mike, so very, very much. I would only have the authority to put out reminders to teachers, because, again, I'm learning from experts in the classroom like those that are listening out there all the time. For me, the reminder would be to not forget that the students you're engaging with are absorbing ideas and interacting with them in ways that we can just never understand or expect. I just have a few stories. I'll tell two. I had a phone call a number of years ago. As I mentioned when I opened, I had the privilege of teaching high school English for 5 years. And probably 15 years ago, I received a phone call out of nowhere. The woman's name was Darcy. I won't use her last name. And she said, "I just want to thank you for being such an inspiration on me and giving me insight and freedom to study and learn. And I'm not sure I ever said that when I was a student in your class. And I'm not looking to extend our relationship or ask anything from you like a letter of recommendation." said, I just wanted you to know that. And I hung up the phone and I turned to my wife and I said, darling, I don't know if I remember Darcy. I don't think she ever spoke up and had kind of those characteristic qualities that we say, oh yes, this person's going to go on in English in someday. So the first thing would be a reminder of, we just have no idea what our students are thinking or absorbing, regardless of how they're responding, reacting, or even listening. The second one is a little bit more inspirational, but I'm not afraid to share it. I did have a student who was a sophomore in my class, and there's a lot of things we do as teachers we hope has an impact, and some of them seem really idealistic. And one thing I used to do is I wrote a poem for the class. I loved the class so much, I wanted some way of documenting how much they inspired me. And so, I was young, naive, and idealistic, and so I gave the class a poem. And, years went by, and we get a little bit older and a little bit more savvy, and we say, well, I don't know if I need to do those kind of things anymore, if it really makes a difference. 17 years after that, I got a phone call from a student. His name is Rick. And he said, I just wanted to let you know that I have just taken my first PhD job teaching future educators in English, and I am moving into my offices at my university, and though I have an amazing wife and an unbelievable family, the first thing I'm putting up on my wall is that poem you wrote us when I was a sophomore in high school. I could not believe that students like this, that you all engage with, have these kind of responses to things that we just can't gauge. And so I would just only serve it as a reminder to continue to fight the good fight, to continue to be a model, as challenging and difficult as things might be on a daily basis with the paperwork and everything that takes us all the way from actual teaching. There are amazing invitations to people that really make an actual difference. And so I'd like to end where I started. I say it all the time, teaching is the world's most noble profession, and these kind of impacts just are unparalleled. So I thank you all for your contributions and everything you shared tonight.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. What a night it has been. I encourage you to check out the work of Dr. Miller, Jason. Continue to follow all the things that he is doing. Again, we appreciate you joining us to keep up with everything that's happening at the National Humanities Center. You can follow us on our social media channels at National Humanities, at NHC Education as well, and support the humanities education programs, the NHC education programs. We provide that bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. On March 5th, 7 p.m., we have another NHC Fellow from now 2019 to 2025. Yes. Marcia Gordon. So why you should start teaching Ursula Parrott's ex-wife, 1929. And if you enjoyed tonight, I'm certain that you will enjoy Marcia Gordon. And again, Jason, I can't thank you enough. You and I will be in conversation about plans for the future. I have to, personally just thank you for mentioning Reverend Tolukun Omakunde, who is a friend and fraternity brother of mine, who I will actually get off of this webinar tonight and give a call and tell him that I had a chance to chat with you on this evening. But everyone, again, thank you for joining us. We will conclude with a little Nina Simone, Backlash Blues. Continue to have a great week, and thank you all for everything that you are doing for students across America. Take care and be well.